Okay, so welcome everybody to our Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety webinar titled What Can Police Stop Data Tell Us About Traffic Safety? Presented by Liza Lutzker. My name is Nick Ferenczak. I'm the director for the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety and a professor in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of New Mexico. Our center is a 5-year university transportation center supported by the U.S. Department of Transportation, and we consist of the University of New Mexico, San Diego State University, University of California, Berkeley, University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. We've got tons of research projects going on, so feel free to go to our website to check those out, pedbikesafety.org. And in addition to all the research, we've got our webinar series, so you can go to the website and see upcoming webinars. We've got a newsletter, so if you're interested in that, you can go to our website, go to the bottom, and you can put in your email address there and sign up for our newsletter, and then also follow us on LinkedIn, where we're always posting new reports, papers, presentations that are coming out of the center. Okay, so to jump into today's presentation, as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the Q&A box. So if you go to the bottom ribbon on your screen, you should see Q&A. So you can put any questions and comments in there, and I'll be moderating the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. All right, so without further ado, I will introduce our speaker. So Liza Lutzker is a researcher at UC Berkeley's Safe Transportation Research and Education Center, or SafeTREC, and a doctoral student in the Division of Epidemiology at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health. Her research focuses on traffic safety outcomes, particularly for people walking and biking, applying methods for causal inference and social epidemiology to examine how social factors, institutions, and neighborhood environments influence population health and roadway safety. At SafeTREC, Liza's work explores the role of police traffic enforcement in promoting roadway safety, the collection and analysis of crash data, and how state and local jurisdictions can best implement the safe systems approach. Before joining SafeTREC, Liza worked in environmental and occupational epidemiology at the Massachusetts and California Departments of Public Health, as well as in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences at UC Berkeley's School of Public Health. She holds a Master of Public Health in Epidemiology from the Yale School of Public Health. Liza, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. I'm going to go ahead and share. I just want to make sure you're seeing my screen. Is that right?
Looks great.
Okay, great. All right, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here today to share this work that has been really fun to get into. It holds a lot of promise. This is a work in progress due to kind of the size and complexity of the data set that we're working on, but a lot of interesting things are coming out of it so far. So before I get started officially, just want to thank my collaborators and funders on this. So Julia Griswold, the director of SafeTREC, my doctoral advisor, Corinne Riddell in the School of Public Health, and Jack Glazer, who's a professor in the School of Public Policy at Berkeley, focusing on policing. And thanks so much to the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety, both for hosting this webinar and providing funding for this, as well as a training grant that I'm on that helped support some of the work that I'm doing here. So just to get started, if anyone wants to learn more about this kind of topic on this slide, I definitely recommend this fantastic book by Professor Sarah Seo at Columbia, Policing the Open Road, but just to talk a little bit about the history around policing and traffic violations. So as car ownership began to rise in the 1919s and 20s, road safety obviously became a huge issue, and there were actually really split opinions among police leadership across the country about whether police should be the agency tasked with enforcing traffic rules or whether their focus should remain squarely on the prevention and solving of crimes. As we all know, one camp won out in that debate, and now it is our law enforcement agencies that are almost exclusively responsible for traffic law enforcement. Another really critical link is that at the same time as the automobile was rising in this country, prohibition was in place in the US. And cars actually became a tool for transporting illegal alcohol, which opened up this link between cars and crime. And that link has shaped much of the national conversation for the past century, mostly as it relates to the Fourth Amendment, which is the amendment around illegal search and seizure. So, through a series of court cases starting in the 1920s and coming all the way up to the 1990s, basically there have been exceptions granted to the Fourth Amendment search and seizure clauses, specifically a lot of them around motor vehicles, where there's no warrant needed to search vehicles. And these court cases explicitly codified into law what is now known as a pretext stop, goes by other names, pretextual stop. And this is when a police officer conducts a traffic stop in order to investigate whether a person is engaged in a criminal activity. And they can do so as long as there is a reasonable suspicion to believe that any traffic violation has occurred. And that traffic violation does not have to have anything to do with the suspected criminal activity. And so some scholars have argued that kind of this mixture between crime and traffic safety purposes of traffic stops has made police officers somewhat of a distracted partners in improving traffic safety. And so there's an interest in understanding how traffic safety can really be improved with police traffic enforcement in light of this. So most of you are all probably familiar with the safe system approach. Just wanted to talk about how traffic enforcement fits in, right? The safe system approach is about creating upstream proactive solutions to accommodate the fact that humans make mistakes, including designing roads and vehicles in ways that make safe driving behavior the default, such as traffic calming, creating dedicated spaces for pedestrians and bicyclists, or intelligent speed assist in vehicles. But also part of the safe system approach is that redundancy is crucial. And when the proactive system design fails to create safety, enforcement can be used to supplement efforts as a reactive measure. And so this most often happens in this safe road users area where we are trying to kind of correct some of these behaviors, DUI, yielding, safe turning, and also in the safe speeds arena where there's specifically enforcement around speeding. It's important to remember that we do need to, even if we use enforcement within a safe system approach, that we don't rely on it as the primary strategy and that we need to balance it with other elements of proactive design. So how does traffic enforcement work? What is the theory behind it? Well, deterrence theory is the underlying foundation for most criminal justice policies and practices in the United States, including traffic safety enforcement, and it falls into two groups. One here is specific deterrence, where we use punishment to discourage individual offenders from reoffending, and then general deterrence, which is the use of general fear of punishment to discourage potential offenders from offending. And so these are different approaches that traffic safety enforcement tries to target. The specific deterrence can be pretty easily measured because you can look at offenders and how many of them reoffend. General deterrence is a little bit harder. How well do these work? Well, in specific deterrence, for example, in New York City, we can look at automated speed enforcement, and we see that about 3/4 of drivers who receive one violation don't receive another or only receive one more violation within that calendar year. But also, it has its limitations. And in 2023 in New York City, there were nearly 12,000 vehicles that received over 20 violations in a single year. And so the specific deterrence was less effective in that case. Deterrence theory really hinges on these three aspects: the certainty of being caught, the swiftness of punishment, and the severity of the penalty. And I'll come back to all of these, but the certainty of being caught is thought by most criminal legal scholars to be the most important of these. And now I want to kind of try to limit the scope of what I'm talking about here, but first describe these three broad categories of enforcement and traffic safety in the US. So the first is what I'm calling traditional traffic enforcement. This is performed by folks who, officers who are out on the road, either traffic units or patrol, who are moving around the community. And when they see someone commit a violation, they will pull them over. Then we have high visibility enforcement, which are these larger campaigns that often involve police overtime because they are really these big projects where there are these highly visible, proactive law enforcement campaigns to address a very specific safety issue with high visibility elements and a publicity strategy that also promotes education and voluntary compliance. These are things like DUI checkpoints, click it or ticket campaigns, targeted speeding campaigns. And then finally, we have automated enforcement, which is legal and illegal in different states in various different ways. But of course, this involves no personnel on the ground, right? Obviously, there's some people reviewing violations, but it generally is talking about automated speed enforcement, red light cameras, but increasingly to include school bus arm violations, stop sign violations, and then recently we've been seeing some instances of cell phone use or seatbelt violations. My focus for this specific project is traditional traffic enforcement. It's the most common of these and also the least well studied when it comes to its effectiveness in promoting traffic safety, whereas the traffic safety benefits of high visibility enforcement and automated enforcement are fairly well established. I will note that within most police stop databases and the ones that I'm using, it's actually not yet possible to pull out high visibility enforcement campaigns from the regular kind of background level of stops, although that's something that I'm looking into trying to do in the future. Okay, I also want to narrow the scope a little bit to focus on the United States and the studies that I'm using to inform this work and why situating this in the United States is important, while also, taking some lessons where applicable from other countries. So we're obviously a very heavily car-dependent country with a high number of VMTs and very few alternatives for transportation in most areas. And as such, we have a relatively low appetite for restricting the mobility of drivers because of these inadequate alternative solutions. Very closely related to that is that in the United States, we generally have these very low level penalties, even for very serious traffic infractions. And compared to other countries where penalties are much higher, are sometimes income based on a sliding scale based on your income, or often involve vehicle impoundment or license removal, like even for the lowest level, but serious offenses. We also have these negative externalities in the United States that relate to complex dynamics that we see here. We have complex dynamics around, for example, race and policing that date back to historical reasons for policing. And we've seen that there are traffic stops that have escalated to killings of those who are stopped by the police. We also have complexities in terms of high rates of gun ownership in this country that lead to fears of occupational safety for police officers when performing traffic stops. And the explicit mixing of traffic stops for traffic safety and crime purposes complicate kind of all of these issues. And this last point here is not necessarily specific to the US, but just to note that this traditional traffic enforcement is very resource intensive in terms of personnel and budget. In order to achieve its general deterrence objective, there needs to be a high certainty of being caught. And there's a lack of appetite for this kind of level of policing in many parts of the United States. But also an important thing is, unlike infrastructure, which creates self-enforcing streets with a high upfront cost, it lasts for decades, policing is something that requires high levels of staffing, and those need to be ongoing. What studies of high visibility of enforcement have shown is that actually relatively soon, within a couple of weeks after the high visibility enforcement campaign ends, the things go back to the baseline levels of violations. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about a couple studies that are very relevant for this particular question around traditional traffic enforcement and traffic safety. So there have been a number of studies in the past 15 years to investigate the relationship between traffic enforcement and traffic safety. And the study's findings range from a protective effect of overall enforcement to a protective effect of only certain types of enforcement to no protective effect at all. And so why are we seeing such diversity of findings across these studies? Well, These 5 studies are ones that I selected because they all used crashes as their outcome, and they all used kind of some variation of a stop as their predictor. But there's substantial heterogeneity here. So some of these studies only examined fatal crashes, some examined only injury crashes and fatal crashes, and some looked at all types of crashes. Some looked at just police stops, and some restricted even further to looking at citations. But it's important to note that in California, at least, only about 60% of stops result in a citation. And so you're already kind of skewing your understanding of how police stops impact traffic safety when you restrict about 40% of those out. And there was also heterogeneity in whether these studies looked at state or local police enforcement. Now, I've presented these 5 studies, but there are various other studies that are even more mixed in their methodology, including different predictors such as like staffing or layoffs, media spending, arrests. And then also there's heterogeneity in terms of the outcome. So changes in speed was measured rather than actual safety outcomes, like in terms of injuries or fatalities, or restriction in the types of crashes that were looked at, like DUI crashes only. So okay, so let's assume that we do want to look at stops, that stops are the metric when we're saying what's the impact of enforcement, right? Pulling people over on traffic safety. So if we're just looking at stops, what are we actually seeing across studies? So among those studies that just looked at traffic stops, we have a lot of different ways of classifying things, right? We could look at all traffic stops. A very common way of looking at traffic stops is separating moving equipment and non-moving violations. Another study looked at a variation on this, looking at safety, investigatory, and economic stops. And other studies have gotten a little bit more fine-grained in terms of what they're looking at, dividing it into these kind of smaller categories. Again, like I said, you could look at stops across different agency types. And then the question is, who's being stopped? Is it all stops? Are we lumping pedestrian, bicyclist, and driver and micromobility users all together? Are we excluding pedestrian stops? How do we look at it? Well, the question is, like, what would be optimal to look at? So I'm going to kind of take these same ideas and think about what would we ideally look at from a traffic safety perspective. And the key insight here is that police are actually both the people who do the enforcement on the roadway and also who investigate crashes. And they use the exact same system, the vehicle code, to document both the reason for a stop and the primary collision factor in a crash. And so there's this linkage variable that tells us what is it that is driving the fatal and serious injury crashes. What is the primary collision factor, and can we link that to stops? This is not an approach that I've come up with. It's being used in San Francisco and Oakland, as well as other cities like San Jose moving towards it. Elsewhere might use it. But this is the kind of key that we can actually link what we know about crashes and what kinds of stops are being performed. And so it's important to remember that the primary collision factor documented by police in crashes is not actually the root cause of the crash, right? But it is a contributing factor that they've identified. And if we do decide to use enforcement as part of our safe system approach, this is going to be the target that we want to use to promote traffic safety, right? We should use the data we have and target those behaviors. Now I've moved from agency to talking about location because actually agency is really this kind of operational distinction. Whereas what we really want to know is, are different roadways more likely to have certain types of violations that are linked to fatal and serious injury crashes, whereas that same violation might not be a problem. So like an unsafe lane change is very serious on high-speed roadways like freeways, and much less serious on a lower speed urban road. And then finally, just talking about the mode of the person stopped. No studies have really kind of looked at that, but it's important to look at that because we actually have many violations that apply to multiple modes, and the question of who we're enforcing against is important because there are different levels of contribution to traffic safety by mode. So a prime example of that is a failure to stop at a stop sign. So when a bicyclist treats a stop as yield, that has been shown to not be any more dangerous than treating a stop as a stop sign. Whereas the same is not true for a driver failing to stop at a stop sign. And so kind of teasing this out and, not pulling over bicyclists who treat a stop as a yield is more of a traffic safety risk driven approach. Okay, so given all this, what have we been doing? So in 2015, California passed AB 953, the Racial Identity and Profiling Act, which requires the uniform collection of police stop data across law enforcement agencies in California. It was phased in, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It includes stops of drivers, bicyclists, and pedestrians, and it requires police officers to document the reason for the stop. Some RIPA data are publicly available. There's also a confidential database that is available to researchers through an application to the California Department of Justice. And that confidential data set includes the stop narrative and a stop location. So we applied for and eventually gained access to this confidential data, and we are the first researchers to gain access to this confidential RIPA data. We've had it for about 10 months, and we've been working our way through it. It's not terribly well structured for outside researchers with very little documentation provided, but we've been making some good progress. And we have identified that the data granularity within this confidential file should allow us to examine the stops by their traffic safety risk. So just to describe a little bit about how RIPA data were collected, this was a phased-in approach starting in July 2018, with the very largest agencies being required to report initially, followed in 2019 and 2020 by the next largest round of agencies. Then in 2021, somewhat larger, and then by 2022 and 2023, all agencies, all law enforcement agencies across the entire state are now required to report their police stop data to the Department of Justice. Now, not all of these are traffic violations. This entire database has over 20 million stops in it. Those that are labeled as traffic violations are about 17.5 million. Some are specifically related to crime, like stopping someone who has a warrant for their arrest. And then a large number of the pedestrian violations actually don't relate to traffic, but are kind of quality of life infractions like loitering or public intoxication. So now we are looking at these traffic violations of 17.5 million. So I'm going to provide some descriptive statistics around what that file looks like. So again, 2018 to 2023, 17.5 million stops. Despite all of them being labeled as traffic violations, not quite all of them are vehicle code violations. So that's something that we're trying to understand a little bit more. But most of them are. If we look at this kind of categorization that police provide of the moving equipment and non-moving stops, we see that over 2/3 of stops are classified as moving violations. But again, this is a fairly broad heterogeneous category. In terms of the results of stop, as I mentioned before, only 60% result in a citation, whereas 36% have no action or warning. I've grouped those together here. And this other category are things like arrests or psychiatric holds in this remaining 3.5%. The agency type is dominated by the California Highway Patrol. You can see the distributions in other places. I'll just note that the other law enforcement agencies at the bottom here includes things like parks districts or K through 12 schools that have their own police force. These descriptive statistics are a little bit skewed because, of course, the earlier years of RIPA data collection include only the largest agencies. So on the next slide, I'm going to show what that looks like just for 2022 and 2023 to get an idea of a more representative selection of what is going on across law enforcement agencies in the state. So when I limit it to those 2 years, we have 7.5 million stops. And the things I want to just call attention to here are in this last kind of delta change category of how did it change from when you just looked at all the years to when you restrict to when this is a more representative group. So one is that in the violation category, you have a fair number more equipment violations and fewer of the others. you have more stops that result in no actions or warnings. And I'll just say that these two kind of groups, no, like equipment violations and no actions or warnings, are actually indicative of pretty high levels of pretext stops. These are like classic patterns that someone's pulled over for an equipment violation, broken taillights, the clearest one. And then once an officer determines that there's not actually a crime being committed, they let the person go. So that's why these are kind of hallmarks of pretext stops. And then, of course, in agency type, we see that the California Highway Patrol no longer predominates. It's less than half of the records, and we see a lot more municipal police departments showing up in this file. So what's the overall goal of this project? Well, it's multiple fold. Ultimately, we are hoping to generate a census block level file of police traffic enforcement that is specific for use of traffic safety purposes. So personally, for me, I will be using these files to evaluate the impact of traffic stops on safety outcomes. This will be part of my dissertation work. But also this can help jurisdictions better align their own enforcement efforts with traffic safety. And then finally, we're hoping to be able to share this file more widely so that different researchers can use, let's say they're interested in the impacts of an infrastructure change, and they can then control for traffic, levels of traffic enforcement using this file. So that's the ultimate goal here. So how are we going about doing this? Well, I kind of presented to you earlier what would be ideal. We want to use traffic safety that we know from crash data and then apply that to the stop data. So I'm going to talk about the first part first, which is what do we know about the different violations in the crash data? So in California, right, we can use our crash data system to rate the primary collision factors in terms of how they relate to these fatal and serious injury crashes. We can use this California Vehicle Code violation to do that. We can also, SafeTrack takes the statewide crash data from SWITRS, which is our crash data system, and geocodes all that data. And we're able, using that geocoding, to get roadway functional classification, and then also use Caltrans boundaries of urban rural and divide the location of crash by the kind of roadway environment. So looking at freeways and expressways as very different environments from rural roads as very different from urban roads. And then finally, in California, our crash data also, in addition to providing the violation, provides information about the party who was found at fault and the mode of travel that they were using. And so we're also able to not only get the code of the violation, the kind of roadway where it occurred, but we know who is doing this, who was responsible for this crash. Okay, so I'm going to present a very busy slide on the next slide, and I promise I'll break it down in the future, but I want to make some big observations about it. Okay, so here, this slide shows the California crash data from 2012 to 2021, and it is ranks, or it sorts by the count of contribution to fatal and serious injury crashes, the violation by mode for each of these three roadway environments. And again, I'll talk more about this because I know this is very small and busy, but I think a couple things I want to draw folks' attention to is on this bottom row, the total. You can see that the majority of the fatal and serious injury crashes in California occur in urban environments on urban roads, even more than these freeways and rural roads combined. Even though speeds on these urban roadways are generally lower, it is where the population is highest and also where pedestrians and bicyclists are most abundant. The other thing I want you to notice is these rows highlighted in red, which is that actually in each of these three environments, the same exact three violations are responsible for the top three, or are the top three causes of, or the top three primary collision factors associated with fatal and serious injury collisions. And those are unsafe speed, drug and alcohol involved, and unsafe turning. They are in different order, but that's important to note. we'll talk about this a little bit more, but you'll also note that that the freeways are relatively homogeneous environments, and the urban roadways are very heterogeneous in terms of what is linked to fatal and severe injury crashes. So the top three violations account for 80% of all the violations in the freeways. They are 72% in the rural roads, but they're only 40%, these top three, on urban roads. The last thing that I want to just say on this table before I get into it more is that there are going to be some violations that don't show up as primary collision factors using this method. Things like seatbelt use and helmet use among, for example, motorcycle users or youth. They're not going to get assigned as a primary collision factor because they don't contribute to the likelihood of a crash, but they do contribute to the severity. And so we need to figure out ways to account for those separately. Another item that doesn't show up on here is distracted driving. Although it could be used as a primary collision factor, it's very difficult for police to establish that a driver or other user was distracted using a cell phone or other device. And so it's very unlikely to show up as a primary collision factor, and so also needs to be accounted for separately. Okay, so before getting into each of these environments, I want to talk a little bit about the rating system and how I created it. So within each roadway environment, I used k-means clustering to cluster these counts. And it was like a violation by a mode. And I a priori decided on 5 clusters, and this is the reason. I wanted to know what were the extremely dangerous and quite dangerous violations, ranked 5 and 4 respectively, or rated 5 and 4. The violations that were very, very unlikely to result in a fatal and serious injury crash, and those that were somewhat likely. So those were 1 and 2. And then I wanted a third middle category to capture stuff in the middle. I'll note that these clusters were not very sensitive to random seed. They held pretty well regardless. And so I had these rankings: 5 most related to safety, 1 least related to safety. And then in some cases, I will say that I created a separate rating of 0 to override some of the mistakes, I believe, that are in these ratings. So there were some instances where crashes were given a primary collision factor that was somehow implausible. So like the violation by mode didn't make sense. So for example, a pedestrian was faulted with an unsafe speed violation. Or sometimes the violation itself is purely regulatory, like giving governments the permission to post a sign. So in those cases, even if the rating was given a 1 to 5, I overrode it with a 0. This was done in a very small number of cases, only 37 cases, less than 0.03%. And these likely represent just typos and mistakes by officers. I will also note that there are a pretty large number of violations where there are no crashes that are a pretty large number of primary collision factors that could be used that are never used because they just don't contribute to crashes. And sometimes those could plausibly contribute to a crash. So for example, like illegal stopping on the roadway could contribute to a crash. But something like displaying a license plate incorrectly couldn't possibly contribute to a crash. And so if it could, it received a rating. If it couldn't, it also received a 0. So now we have these 6 different ratings, sorry, 1 through 5, and then a 0 for it's not going to be related to traffic safety. Okay, so going into these different environments. So first, these limited access roadways or freeways and expressways. Like I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of fatal and serious injury crashes on these limited access roadways are caused by a very small handful of violations. The top 5 together account for 94% of all crashes. And each of the ones after that account for less than 1% each. A couple comments on this. You might note that even in these top 12, there are some references to like pedestrians in crosswalks or stoplights or stop signs. These are happening on on ramps and off ramps where there are these devices and markings. I'm going to move on to the rural roadways. Again, these top three causes are predominant, but what you can see is that there's actually more heterogeneity after that. As opposed to previously here with the freeways, we see even crashes ranking as two show up here, but here you don't even see two. And this three category, if you kept going, there are 15 total three ranked violations. You'll note here, this is not surprising, these rural roads in California are predominantly two-lane rural roads, and so turning, crossing over center lines, driving on the wrong side of the road, and unsafe passings are major issues in this environment. And then finally, looking at urban roadways, we see even more heterogeneity, right? These are incredibly complex environments, these urban roadways with lots of intersections, lots of pedestrians and bicyclists, many different types of signs and signals and markings. And you can see that the distribution of the percentage of that each violation contributes to fatal and serious injury crashes is they're a lot more closely clustered together. So even though a rating of 5 does cover 75% of all fatal and serious injury crashes, instead of being clustered in the top 3, here it's spread across 9 violations. And so it's a very different environment, and this kind of further emphasizes the need to split apart these different roadway environments. One thing I want to talk about here are these kind of assignment of fault to pedestrians showing up in these top ratings, and there's sometimes some bicyclists in others. A project that I'm working on in the coming year is trying to understand whether there may be some misattribution of fault to pedestrians and bicyclists in some of these crashes. And that may just be a result of the fact that when a driver is involved in a crash with a pedestrian or bicyclist, often the driver is the only one conscious and or alive at the scene to report to the police officer what happened, and that may skew the kind of side of the story. And so I may need to adjust some of these ratings to account for any potential misattribution of fault towards pedestrians and bicyclists, but that's coming down the road. Okay, so now we have these ratings. What do we do next? Well, the next step is to apply them to the RIPA stop data. And so again, remember that police in California must record the reason for stopping someone. So that means if they're pulling someone over for a traffic violation, they have to indicate the vehicle code violation that they're pulling them over for. And so what we can do is we can link our traffic safety ratings by the vehicle code violation indicated in the stop. We can also use stop data location to classify the stop as happening on a freeway or expressway, a rural roadway, or an urban road, same as we did for the crashes. And then again, we can use the RIPA stop data, hopefully, to identify the mode of the person stopped. Okay, the first one is pretty easy. The second two are a little trickier, and I'll get into those. So how do we get this roadway environment from RIPA stop data? Well, there is this location variable in the RIPA stop database, but it's not actually an address. If we're lucky, it's a block number and a street name. So like 1300 University Ave. Cross streets are pretty good, but there are freeway post miles, various landmarks given as locations, and this location field is pretty messy and needs to be cleaned and standardized and geocoded, and so that's a work in progress. In terms of identifying mode, that's where a lot of my work has been, trying to identify mode. So some stops are mode specific. So for example, things like registration or seatbelts, that's only for drivers, or a bicyclist without a light, that's bicycle specific. And that represents about 70% of the stops in the RIPA file. But there are about another 30% are kind of mode ambiguous. And so here I'm showing you this part of the California Vehicle Code that says basically all the rules that apply to drivers also apply to bicyclists. And so you have things like a failure to stop at a light or unsafe speed that police can cite both drivers or bicyclists for. There's also some that include pedestrians. So like a failure to obey police officers could be for any mode. Now, When we first started this project, we thought that mode was being collected in RIPA data, but unfortunately it wasn't at the time, and only starting in 2024 is mode being collected. So that's the bad news, good news. The good news is it's coming. The bad news is it hasn't been there. But what the confidential data does provide is a narrative for each stop. And so we're working to develop a method to identify a mode. So what are we doing? How are we doing that? We're using natural language processing to look back at these data that don't have mode and figure out what it is. So the first step is to create a dictionary specific to modes, and you can see some of the terms on the right that we're putting in this dictionary. We're doing this dictionary-based tokenization and other pre-processing and feeding that into the natural language toolkit library in Python. And the idea is to use each of the narratives and extract a count of mode-specific terms for each record. And then when we get the 2024 data, we'll use that file for a training and testing data and build a multinomial logistic regression machine learning model to predict mode where it's missing using the mode specific word counts, agency type and ID, dates, times, and the demographics of the person stopped. So we don't have the 2024 data yet. So this is the plan, but we're lucky that we can kind of test this method using some other data. So we have a little proof of concept. The Los Angeles Police Department is actually the second largest reporter of stops of RIPA data after the California Highway Patrol. They've been collecting since July 2018, and they have about 2 million stops that they've recorded. Now, in 2021, ahead of the regulations, the LAPD started collecting data on mode, and they started sharing it publicly on their open data portal. And about 31% of stops on the LA data portal have a mode specified. So that's great. And then another 37% of stops, there is a mode specific violation, something like, seatbelt use. So together we have 68% of the records that we can use for training data in this natural language processing model. And so there are only 32% of records with an ambiguous mode that need to be predicted. So using the methodology I just described, we built a model and we were able to get pretty good results. Our F1 score in this machine learning model gave us a balance and that assesses balance and precision, gave us very good prediction of drivers, decent for bikes and okay for pedestrians. We're working to refine this model and we'll see what happens with the statewide data. One of the issues with pedestrians is that the way that scooters get categorized, scooters, skateboards, sometimes they get categorized as drivers if there's a motor. If there's not a motor, they're supposed to get categorized as pedestrians. Sometimes we know that the seated scooters are being coded as bicyclists, so there's some complication there. Okay, so we're able to see that this works pretty well for predicting mode with the LAPD data. The LAPD data also provides us a really interesting way of testing whether this rating system is sensitive to what's actually happening on the ground. And also, excitingly, there was a policy change in LA that allows us to assess this. So in March of 2022, LAPD established a new policy on the limitation on the use of pretextual stops, where basically they said that unless there is intelligence or information about a specific crime or public safety concern, that vehicle equipment violations that don't have strong causal connections to collisions should be eliminated or reduced significantly. So we're able to kind of look at that impact. So what if we just don't do anything and we just look at all stops, as many studies have done? So we actually can't see any sensitivity really to this new policy being put into place. There may be some like anticipatory kind of thing going on here where maybe this policy is coming down the pipeline, but it's actually pretty far in advance of the policy, almost like 9 months ahead, where we're seeing this drop kind of happen in before, about 9 months before. What if we separate, as most folks have done, into these kind of moving stops, which we see in green, or versus equipment violations in orange and non-moving violations in blue? Well, we again don't see any change in the moving violations, but we can actually detect a small change here in these non-moving and equipment violations. But what if we apply these traffic safety ratings that I've developed using the crash data? Okay, well, this is a busy chart and I'm going to walk you through it. Um, First, what I want you to take a look at is the traffic safety rating key on the bottom. So the zeros are those that should have no plausible link to traffic safety. Ones have a slight link, a possible link, all the way up to 4 and 5, where we have these very serious violations that are frequently linked to fatal and serious injury crashes. And what we see is that actually in the 2018s, 1920 period, these ones, these very unrelated to traffic safety violations were being used as the most common way of pulling people over in LA. And these pretty serious infractions, this dark red, were actually pretty low on the use there. Things changed a little bit. This is kind of reflecting possibly post, COVID, George Floyd, where some of those stops drop, including the zeros and the ones they drop, and you have a little bit more of a rise in these red categories that are more linked to traffic safety, but you actually see a really significant impact on the stop distribution associated with this policy. So you see a huge drop in the number of stops that are rated 1, a pretty significant in those rated 0, and you see a relative increase in those that are rated a 4 or a 5, with 5s predominating. So it's really exciting to see. People might wonder, what are all these like zeros that people are being pulled over for in these earlier years? Those are mostly license plate display violations. So again, people are not displaying their license plate correctly. This may be a public safety issue in terms of crime and tracking folks, but not necessarily contributing to the likelihood or severity of a crash. Okay, I want to take a quick moment just to look at the issue of the seatbelt, distracted driving, helmet use to see how those assumptions might affect results here. So here I'm just showing the same as from the previous graph, but just the 1s and 4s, because seatbelt violations, helmet use, and distracted driving all end up in my traffic safety rating of 1 if I just use it naively, whereas I would probably, again, this is a little bit of a naive assumption, would put them as a 4. They may not be contributing the most to these fatal and serious injury crashes, but they're a pretty significant contributor. So what would happen if we took out of those that are ranked 1, these 3 different kinds of violations, seatbelt use, helmet use, and distracted driving, and move them into category 4. So this darker line shows us what happens, right? So you see a decrease and a corresponding increase, a decrease in those that are rated 1 and an increase in those that are rated 4. And this is really pretty obvious in these early years where there are a lot of kind of less traffic safety driven efforts going on. And as you get out into these later years, especially post implementation of the pretextual policing policy, that gap narrows and you're not actually seeing that much of a difference. So this is like a pretty crude way of doing it, and I'm looking forward to doing a little bit more. Okay, so I presented all this information on stops, and many of you are probably wondering, well, what happened, for example, in LA after this change went into place? What does traffic safety look like? So I'm going to disappoint you, and I'm going to say I'm trained as an epidemiologist in this causal inference world. And the goal of causal inference is to understand the causal relationship here between safety stops and traffic safety. And if I were to do this in an ideal world, I would do a randomized control trial. And this seminal paper by Don Rubin out of Harvard, a statistician, really sets the foundation for how you do causal inference with observational studies. And he argues that in order for observational studies to yield valid causal estimates, they actually have to approximate randomized trials as closely as possible in every way. And that the design phase of the experiment has to proceed ahead of and completely independently of the analysis phase. And the most critical element of this design analysis split is Rubin's assertion that outcome data cannot be used in the design in any way without compromising the objectivity of the study design. And this prevents p-hacking and systematically favoring one way of analyzing the data over another. And so I am not going to be looking at the outcome data in LA or in anywhere else until I am completely done with the design phase. And I know that's disappointing. Please don't share the outcome data with me. I don't want to see it until I actually get into the analysis. Um, so I'm just going to wrap up with my next steps. Um, I'm hoping to do some more refined adjustment of the ratings related to seatbelts, helmets, distracted driving, more than just this kind of crude one. As I mentioned, a sensitivity analysis to account for the potential misattribution of fault with these pedestrian and bicyclist crashes. When I get the 2024 data, which hopefully will be in the next couple months, to rerun the natural language processing model prediction to get mode out of that, clean and geocode the data, and then ultimately to create this block group level database that hopefully the Department of Justice will let us share fairly broadly, or at least like apply for use of it within kind of a narrow scope. So that is all I have for today, and thank you for your time and happy to take questions.
Great. Thanks, Liza. That was awesome presentation. Exciting stuff going on. And we do have a couple questions. We got 7 so far, and we got a couple minutes, so let's jump into it. All right, so first question, has your research investigated police officers themselves as road users? For example, how often do police conduct high-speed chases that endanger other road users or just drive too fast when not engaged in a chase?
Yeah, that's a great question. My work has not specifically looked at that, but there are opportunities to do that. I think one of the things is like there is in, for example, variables in FARS that talk about officer involved, that's the cause of death. And I think that estimates that come from elsewhere versus FARS may be different. I do think that these high-speed chase policies are a really important and interesting like policy lever. And I think there are many jurisdictions that continue to do them and others that are questioning kind of the overall public safety benefit when, for example, the high speed pursuit is like for vehicle theft. Is it really worth sending 20 vehicles down the road at high speeds and generating the possibility of many fatal and serious crashes? But that I have not looked at that specifically with this work now.
Great, thank you. Has any research independently validated the assessment of police officers as to primary collision factors? What kind of training do officers receive for assessing the causes of crashes?
That's a great question. I mean, so there is a pretty comprehensive manual in California that talks about how officers should be investigating and documenting collisions. I think there are a variety of levels of training that different officers receive, and I think for the most, for fatalities and serious injuries, they bring in officers who have more experience and more training on these issues. I do think that this is, an area that's ripe for a lot of additional training for police. Um, I think one of the complicated factors around police being the primary actors in investigating crashes is that they are not road safety professionals. They are trained as, crime fighting officers, and they have some training in, crash reconstruction and those sorts of things, but a huge portion, like a huge driver in their investigations is actually in providing data for insurers and understanding fault and possibly understanding whether a crime was committed and not trying to actually improve road safety. And I think that you're seeing in some cities collaborations between like departments of transportation and police going to investigate crash scenes together. It's not going to change necessarily, it may change the primary collision factor that's listed, but certainly in terms of efforts that can be made to improve the roadway and other things that might not be clearly indicated in the crash report, there's a lot of work that can be done there at a city level.
Great, thank you. And I think you touched on this one in your presentation a little bit, but how are other modes of travel captured, i.e. e-scooters, skateboards, etc.? Could a pedestrian be going too fast? Could that really be someone on an e-scooter?
Yeah. So I think that the scooters are like the biggest problem in these. And it's interesting because actually there was an effort based out of San Francisco's Vision Zero team a number of years ago to get hospital classification codes to include a separate ICD code for scooters. But we haven't caught up to that yet either in the crash data or in the stop data. And that's a real limitation because again, right, the scooters are, I am fairly certain just from looking at the narratives that scooters are being captured as pedestrians, as drivers, and as bicyclists. And it's a small percentage of the stops and maybe a less small percentage of the fatal and serious injury crashes, but it's something that I think needs to be worked on by folks working on kind of data, designing the data system. And I think there's a lot of improvement given the huge rise of micromobility.
Great. For the purposes of the research, what was the definition of drug or alcohol involved? Did this include possession in absence of intoxication?
Right. So no, well, I believe that drug or alcohol involved requires, in terms of the crashes, it requires that there be uh, evidence either through testing, laboratory testing, or through like a field sobriety test that there was drug or alcohol involved. On the stop end, there's more, it's clearer. And so on the stop, there's like this person was stopped and they definitely were violating, or they were stopped because I suspected them of driving intoxicated. And then there are others where it's very clear that they just were possessing it.
Mhm.
Yeah. And a tricky one, actually, and this is the target of certain policies in other states, including in Virginia, is the smell of marijuana is one that often is targeted as possibly a pretext stop because it's very difficult to deny or substantiate. It's kind of something that an officer can say, well, I thought I smelled marijuana coming from the car. And often it kind of mimics the patterns of other pretextual stops in terms of the demographics of who's stopped and kind of what happens after the stop is initiated. But it's also, you know, driving while intoxicated is also a big safety concern. So it's a tricky one to figure out.
Yep. Yeah, and we've got maybe one time for one more question, related question here. Are you aware of any efforts to understand and report second collision factors in drug alcohol related crashes? When we stop at analyzing or categorizing the crash, once we know the driver was impaired, I feel that we leave out useful information for a large percentage of the crashes.
Yeah, so I think another thing that I have been, so in California, we have the primary collision factor, and then we also have, I'm trying to remember what it stands for, OAF, other, uh, it's a kind of a contributing factor. So there are other factors that are involved, and one of the thoughts is if if there's a crash, you know, not just looking at the primary collision factors, but also kind of uprating certain crash factors that may not show up as the primary collision factor, but are listed as a very frequent contributor to other crashes, thinking about kind of uprating those in terms of their safety, traffic safety rating.
Great. Well, looks like we are at time. So thank you, Liza, for a great presentation and all the work on this project. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and all the great questions. Sorry that we didn't get to all of them. But yeah, thanks again, everybody, and please feel free to check out our Center for Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety website. We've got some upcoming webinars. You can sign up for those. And yeah, any final words, Liza?
No, thank you all for being here. I'm excited to eventually share this work with other folks so that it can be useful for your own work in the state of California.
Sounds good. Great. Well, thanks everybody, and hope everybody has a good day.